have to defer.
So what's the sticking point, sir?
Some of the countries, one or two,
which countries are those?
That need to hold further consultations to take what we have agreed upon to their capitals to show them this is what the group has agreed upon. We are all prayerful and hopeful that this virus will be overcome within the shortest possible time. We have extended our solidarity to the government and people of China. This is a human tragedy that is now spreading all over the world. And we commend all governments who are taking very strong proactive measures to be able to contain this virus. But we don't know how long this virus is going to last, especially the impact.
We are concerned because it does have an impact on revenue. And at the current crude oil price of 53% is below the budget benchmarks. So what we're doing is we're studying the situation, and when the budget was passed, we committed to doing a mid-term review. So when we do the mid-term review, if the revenues are so significantly affected, we'll have to do some revisions in the budget by way of budget adjustment. But I also want to inform this meeting that the crude oil production is now at 2 million barrels per day, and in some days it has even moved up to 2.1 million barrels per day. So that in itself would be a cushion, but all the same, we are not taking any measures now until we have a reasonable period within which we make a review, and then we may need to do an adjustment to the budget through working together with the National Assembly.
Welcome back. Yes, indeed, we're starting with that particular story, and we've got Mr. Bukar Kyari joining us this morning via Skype. He's an economist and the former chairman of Nigeria Economic Summit Group. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Now, this has certainly some implications on Nigeria, even though they're all expressing some sort of optimism, saying, well, we're hoping it will be resolved soon. But we heard the minister speaking about how they may need to adjust, working with the National Assembly, the budget benchmark, and moving forward on that. But give us your immediate impressions, what you think about the implication of this oil price slump on Nigeria.
Thank you, Chamberlain. Good morning. I think two things have happened that certainly would make the Minister of Finance go back to the drawing table. And the first is actually the coronavirus, which had an implication on demand. China being the largest consumer of crude oil in the world, meaning the largest importer, that is, of close to 30%. Factories went idle, and therefore no need for importation of crude oil. And so crude oil had started sliding anyway. So if the person that consumes 30% of the supply is choking, then the entire crude oil pricing will begin to choke. And that's what has started happening. In addition to that, OPEC plus, which basically means OPEC plus Russia, usually have been working in tandem for the last 3 years or so. Unfortunately, last week, they did not come to an agreement on production cut. I believe that the production cut was around 1.5 million, OPEC 1 million, and Russia to take the remaining. Because of that, even prior to that meeting, there has been whispers in the market that Saudi Arabia has been discounting crude oil to the tune of about $7 to $8 per barrel. Now what they have done is basically to go full-blown price war globally, meaning that they have increased production to 10 million barrels per day, and the indication is that they might go all the way up to 2 million barrels per day. Now, in a market where the demand has shrunk and you oversupply, the price is naturally going to come down. That's why some analysts expect a $30 or even a sub-$30 Brent crude oil price per day. Now, the implications for us in Nigeria is that number one, our budget assumption was $57 per barrel, million barrels per day, on an assumption of 2.2 or 2.3 million barrels per day. Now, we have never met 2.3 million in the recent past in the first place. Therefore, it means that our budget would have gone into a deficit situation. But now, let me give you an example. If we get $57 million per barrel per day for the entire year and produce it at 2.2 million barrels, then we could meet all the requirements. Even then, we would still need to borrow 2.2 trillion naira to make up for the federal budget. Now, where a discussion is going on around $30 per barrel, plus the fact that even the minister just indicated that we have hit 2 million barrels per day, probably 2.1, which means the average for the entire year may not exceed more than that 2 million barrels per day. Now, that means that the gap is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million per day for the rest of the year. That, on an estimate, would be about $1 billion gap. Now, that means the deficit is going to increase naturally. Or, as the minister had indicated, we need to go back to the drawing board to adjust the expectations of the budget, which means expenses have to be slashed, or of course, naturally, when there is lower economic activity, tax receipts may also go down. So the situation is really dire. But here is the other thing. My own expectation is that this price war is probably a game of chicken to see who would blink first. And so we may see a resolution of this issue in the next probably 3 or 4 weeks. But if it gets prolonged, the entire global economy would go into a recession situation, because the markets globally, Monday, the markets in Australia and Japan have gone down, and the futures, both in Wall Street and London, are all looking down, which means that the markets are going to be down today. And that's a reaction of this Saudi oil price war.
You know, part of, much as you said, yes, this is a game between them trying to see who blinks first, and it may be resolved. But while all of these meetings happen time and again, this kind of situations throw themselves up, and we know the nature of our economy, do you think that we usually are able to read all of these activities rather than us just taking a hit? Have you seen any, or how proactive can we be other than talk about us diversifying the economy?
Lately, Nigeria has not been proactive at all. We have never done, even if we have done, it had never been shown to us of sensitivity analysis of crisis that happen globally. Even this coronavirus, which is something that happens periodically. Viruses globally hit somewhere in the neighborhood of once every 10 years or thereabouts. Now, we do not have that planning culture, or in fact, this is where the former minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala used to say, you know, the fact that we set some money aside the structure that she wanted to put in place, even that had not been fully utilized or implemented, meaning that the proceeds of those savings should have been kicked in right now. Unfortunately, we are not quite in that situation. When things are good, we spend. We spend like a drunken sailor. When things are bad, then we begin to retreat. And that retreat is not good when you are an emerging market with a high growing population. The situations would basically spiral quite quickly downhill.
So when you mention some of the responses you expect from the government, I'd like to build on that. Now, this is a thing. We're not sure when this will end, in a week, in a matter of weeks, a matter of months, who knows? So right now, from this morning, what kind of response do you expect from the Nigerian government, from the ministries and, all other, councils that are involved, maybe perhaps the Economic Advisory Council also? What actions do you expect from them?
I would expect the Economic Advisory Council to kick in and make some of their recommendations known to the government. These sorts of bodies are not supposed to discuss whatever recommendations they are making publicly. So I would expect them to also send out some feelers or some bold recommendations to government. The minister's indication, even though this is quite preliminary, means that she and some of her team may also need to go back to the drawing board very quickly. The situation is fluid, meaning that this thing could stop in the next week or so. But it's not like your tap in your bathroom where you can actually turn things off and turn them on quite on a dime. Once you start production, the production has to go somewhere. I do believe that it's just a way for Saudi to put its foot down and say that, look, globally speaking, we are the leaders here when it comes to crude oil production. It has a negative implication on themselves even, because Aramco is now a listed company. And I understand that the shares of Aramco had gone down by 10%, which doesn't look that good for Saudi Arabia. But they're actually doing it to tell the world, and Russia in particular, that, look, they mean business. And the impact is going to be not only on Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, for that matter, those you might call not quite friendly countries to Saudi Arabia / the US, but it also affects some of the OPEC members that are that one might call are marginal players in the game. A nation like Nigeria will be impacted devastatingly, seriously, because we don't have savings to fall back on. And therefore, this sort of situation need to be handled cautiously. And the response from us as a nation need to be smart and intelligent enough so that the people can actually rally around and support whatever moves the government makes.
It's also interesting to see that the U.S. is being affected by this move from Saudi Arabia. But, back to Nigeria, we understand that, this is going to be a major issue for us in the coming days. But then there's also the side of the price, for example, of petrol, because once the price of crude drops, that should mean that the price of petrol, at least the landing costs, should drop. Do you see that perhaps happening in the short term or medium term? Just to know.
It should. The ships that are laden with PMS are on their way, and they are done at a price that was down. But down the road, prices of PMS will come down, and therefore the subsidy number is going to reduce. Now, we would still continue to pay subsidy. Now, if we are going to make a very bold move, this might be one of those situations where we could truly remove subsidy from our psyche, which is to say, if it comes down to such a level that the subsidy could be removed, then let's bite the bullet and kick in. And therefore, even when prices start going up, they should go up along with the PMS, and therefore government ought not to be paying subsidy. Rather, that money should go into more productive endeavor, such as education, healthcare, infrastructure.
I'm concerned about something that you mentioned the other time and the implication on Nigeria's economy. A significant chunk of our budget is set aside for debt servicing. You also said the other time that we'll need to borrow some 2 trillion naira or thereabouts to fund this budget. That's beside the $22.7 billion loan that's just been agreed to. Now, with dwindling oil prices and oil revenue, what's the implication on our repayment plan of debts short-term or long-term?
The implications are dire. One country just defaulted on their Eurobonds, and that is Lebanon. Lebanon's debt to GDP ratio had surpassed 100%. We are still nowhere near even 30%. I think we're somewhere around 29 or 28%. Now, there is comfort there. However, we do not have enough revenue to service the debt wisely. By that I mean our numbers, revenue numbers that we allocate to debt service has been increasing in the last 3 or so years, and increasing at a speed, at a rate that is far higher than even the debt growth. Now, debt on itself is not bad. You and I can borrow to invest. If you borrow to educate yourself, for example, you might become the president of Channels TV. Who knows? But the reason why you're borrowing is to increase your productivity. So it's the same with nations. If we borrow, we must have a commensurate increase or higher increase in productivity, which is not happening. If our productivity level is lower than the rate of debt growth, that means that we will have to come up to a time when we have to pay back. And at that time, it will make us paupers. Now, there might be a situation where one of the things that nobody talks about, which may actually become a major thing, is that the foreign reserves have been declining lately. And what may happen probably towards the end of this year might be that we may hit that threshold that the CBN governor used to mention, which is about $30 billion in foreign reserves. Now, if we are getting closer to that number, then it means that the next course of action on his side, on the monetary side, might be devaluation, because all the other monetary tools have not come to play, because inflation certainly is ratcheting up again and may continue to ratchet up with some of the actions taken. And also, let me put it bluntly, it may not be the fault of the central bank governor, by the way. It is what the global economy had thrown to us, which is the coronavirus and then now that oil price war. Now, all of those, along with the debt level that we have, and the fact that we will end up with a deficit spending, if we don't have strong discipline of execution, we will end up borrowing more, which means we might end up getting into what I would call a slight, we might be in a slight trouble or slight problem when it comes to servicing the debt. Something you gotta give. So either a devaluation or something, or some kind of a structural adjustment, or whatever economists might call it, might come into play.
What would be the implication of that kind of scenario which you have just described now on the various sectors of the economy, the real economy, the SMEs, and any effort at all to diversify Nigeria's economy?
Nigeria's economy has been diversified for quite a while. The problem is that the revenue that the government gets is not well diversified. It's tied to oil. Even though the government taxes have come up, VAT has gone up by 50%, from 5% to 7.5%. Revenue or tax collections are improving. Now, the problem is that tax collections increases when there are a lot of economic activity going on in the economy. Now, if because of the global effect that is hitting us, economic activities begin to dry up or slow down, then the revenue collections would also naturally slow down, and therefore something has to happen. In other economies, for example, in the US, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates.
Okay, well, okay, go on, please, go on.
So if they were responding by inflating the economy or having an expansionary posture. It means that they would rather pump more money into the economy so that more.
Okay. Well, I hope you can still hear us, because one other thing that's giving me a concern, guys, is the fact that, of course, the finance minister has said that there is the hope for a midterm review of the budget. So hopefully, I was going to ask Mr. Bukakari, I don't know if you can still hear us now. I was going to ask Mr. Bukakari if what would be his expectations, you know, in the event that
a lot of people
I know
are saying that is going to come definitely in the face of dwindling oil. I mean, $30, that's really shocking. $57 per barrel, that's our projection. And here we are right now. A lot of projections, I should say, from economists, some saying that we're nearing a recession in 2021. I mean, this is a time for the government to actually come out and say this is what we're doing, because a lot of Nigerians are worried. Oil is our mainstay. It is no news. So it is important for government to actually, as a matter of urgency, come out this morning and say, we have seen the trends and this is what we are doing as a government. On one hand, that will put peace in the minds of Nigerians. Oh, we have Mr. Kyari back, so you can just respond to your question.
Yes, Mr. Bukakari, I'd like to find out. Yes, I'd like to ask you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
What I like about what the Minister of Finance has mentioned is that there is a need for a midterm review, and that's exactly the kind of words that one would expect, because you made an assumption, and things are changing, and they are affecting those assumptions. You need to go back to the drawing board and tweak on those assumptions and come up with something more realistic, rather than put the head in the sand and expect everything to be over. So that act alone is a good move on her part, which is to say that there is need for all of us to go back to the drawing board and have a review of the budget and the budgetary assumptions. And where there is a necessity to tighten our belts, we should. And to me, that will give a certain level of confidence to the private sector, to the business community, as well as to international investors.
When you say tighten our belts, could you be a little more specific? In what area are you talking about?
Let me leave that to actually the policy makers, because I would not make a recommendation of things that might be under discussion. For example, I earlier on mentioned about the subsidy and the subsidy situation, or whatever other things. Even if it is asset sales, there are things that the government could do at the moment where they may get some proceeds coming,
Oh dear. Well, it's quite interesting.
It's going to be very important for us to tighten our belts when we need to. So if the public sector, at least at the government level, if they take that step, he says it will give the private sector a lot more confidence. But perhaps maybe if we do get him back, he may need to respond to this as well. All of this, okay, I think we'll have him back. Well, Mr. Kyari, all of this conversation that we've had about what we need to do such that we don't rely on oil as the mainstay of the economy. What about the economy of states? What can we do? What should we do to ensure that states don't just depend on Abuja for the proceeds of oil? How do we approach that?
Correct. The states should all be looking inwards and be as creative as possible in terms of generating internal revenue, such that there has to be, and you can't generate internal revenue if you do not have economic activity happening in your state. So you have to dress up your state as a governor to attract investors who would set up factories or agricultural production or parts of those value chains and so on and so forth. Right now, majority of the functional factories and industries are in Lagos, and that's why Lagos IGR has been going remember, for the last 18 or so years. Now, on the other hand, most other states cannot have enough IGR to even pay their salaries, meaning the monthly pay for civil servants in those states
They have to wait for a check from Abuja. Now, one of the short-term goals of each state governor ought to be to say, can I generate enough internal revenue to actually pay for salaries in my state? Now, if that can be picked up as one of their core goals and work towards that by attracting investors into their states, then we can begin to see an entirely different economies, 36 economies that are more or less functional, rather than right now where we have maybe, with the exception of 3 or 4 states, the rest are all, had to come to Abuja every month to keep head above water.
Well, that we certainly will look forward to all of that, but we do thank you for your time this morning. Mr. Bukar Kyari is the former chairman, Nigeria Economic Summit Group. Is also an economist himself. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. So, those are some of the issues that you expect authorities to respond to. Yeah. Who knows?
And some are calling this a blessing in disguise.
Oops.
I know. They're saying, well, this is a time for us to tighten those belts and look inwards.
When you say tighten belts, please, what comes to mind for many people is structural adjustment program of the 80s. Oh. So please, and austerity measures.
And also for states to look inward. So for them, it's a blessing in disguise. But for the budget, I don't think so.
All right. Well, back in a moment. Stay with us.